So next up, I'm going to be sharing work that I've done in collaboration with Alban Folzer and Catherine Tillman at the University of Texas at Austin on the effects of language on social essentialist beliefs and stigma about mental illness. So children and adults categorize many aspects of the natural world, and they use category information to make inferences about social category members. Um, and essentialist beliefs about social categories are those beliefs that social categories have these explicit, unmovable boundaries, and that group members share some underlying similarities or this true nature that cannot be observed directly, and that's what makes one group fundamentally distinct from another group. And one common essentialist belief about gender is that a baby born a girl will prefer dolls over trucks. And these kinds of essentialist beliefs emerge early, and children as young as 3 think that there is a fundamental distinction between boys and girls that's responsible for differences in appearance and behavior. So essentialist beliefs are quite common, but they can lead to discrimination and stigma. So for example, hearing essentialist beliefs about gender, like being given biological explanations for sex differences, significantly increases adults' endorsement of gender-based stereotypes. Also, in some cases, stronger essentialist beliefs about race predicts children's and adults' endorsement of negative racial stereotypes. So essentialist beliefs emerge early, but where do they come from exactly? Well, at least in the social domain, we know that essentialist thinking can be transmitted through labels. So Rhodes and colleagues have shown that adults and children who hear generic language to describe a novel social category, like Zarpies are scared of ladybugs, they're more likely to hold essentialist beliefs about that novel social category compared to children and adults who hear a specific language description, like this Zarpie is scared of ladybugs, or children and adults who hear no language label at all. So this one is scared of ladybugs. So simply hearing generic language about a novel social category is enough to lead preschoolers and adults to develop essentialist beliefs about that category. So since the 1980s, there's been a cultural shift, at least among medical professionals, to use person-first language. And more recently, this has been expanded to include not just disabilities, but also mental illness. So for example, using person-first language to say a person with schizophrenia, as opposed to using identity-first language, like saying a schizophrenic person, or using a generic noun, like saying a schizophrenic, when describing people with different mental illness or mental disorders. So one argument is that using person-first language reduces stigmatization and discrimination by emphasizing personhood as opposed to the disability or disorder. And there are some cases where individuals and groups actually strongly prefer identity-first language or generic noun language. For example, members of the autism community have spoken out about their choice not to embrace this notion of person-first language and instead adopt identity-first language to highlight autism as a fundamental part of one's personhood. And what's interesting is that both advocates for person-first language and advocates for identity-first language are arguing that using person-first language reduces social essentialism, but there's actually little empirical evidence to support this claim. So there is at least some evidence that individual differences in essentialist beliefs are associated with differences in language use when talking about individuals with mental illness. So for example, compared to adults with lower levels of essentialist beliefs, adults who show higher levels of essentialist beliefs are more likely to endorse noun labels, like saying he's a schizophrenic, over possessive phrases, like saying he has schizophrenia. And also, there is some work showing that noun-based labels might imply greater essentialism and induce more stereotyping, at least compared to adjective-based labels. So given that children and adults hold strong essentialist beliefs about social categories, and these essentialist beliefs might at least be in part driven by the language that we use to talk about social groups, what we wanted to know is if using person-first labels to talk about individuals with mental disorders would impact stigmatizing and essentialist beliefs about disability and about mental illness. So in the current study, we are examining the effects of person-first, identity-first, and generic noun labels on stigmatizing beliefs and essentialist beliefs about mental illness. And to do this, we recruited non-experts and non-health professionals online. So participants first completed baseline measures that just assess their general essentialism and stigmatizing attitudes in general towards people with mental illness. The measure of essentialism that we used is technically a measure of one's fixed versus growth mindset, but this kind of thinking has been found to overlap with social essentialism, and so we're considering this in our study to be a baseline measure of social essentialism. We then randomly assigned participants to one of 3 language conditions. And then participants were presented with vignettes and randomized blocks by disorder. And then finally, participants completed an essentialist belief scale that just evaluated their essentialist beliefs about each disorder. And we asked participants about their familiarity with each disorder, their familiarity with person first and identity first language, their preference for talking about individuals with mental illness, and if they themselves had ever been diagnosed in their lifetime. So for each block, participants first saw a brief description of the diagnosis, and the language used in the description varied by condition. So here's an example of a person first description that was used for the depression block. So it reads, people with depression often feel sad and uninterested in things they usually enjoy. People with depression may have a hard time sleeping or concentrating on work, or have thoughts about not wanting to be alive. So then participants read 2 vignettes describing individuals with a diagnosis, like Jennifer is a person with depression. Jennifer is a scientist preparing for a research conference. Her lab just hired a new manager. She also likes to cook. So after each vignette, participants completed a stigma against individuals questionnaire that just assessed their stigmatizing beliefs about that character that they read about in the vignette. So 3 disorders that we included, autism, depression, and schizophrenia, were all real diagnoses from the DSM-5. We chose depression as a commonly known low stigma disorder and schizophrenia as a commonly known high stigma disorder. We included autism because in thinking about how many individuals advocate for using identity first language to talk about autism, we thought that this might be a special case. We also included 2 fake disorders. So these are based on real psychological phenomena, but they're totally made up. So this way participants shouldn't have any preconceived notions about these novel disorders. And the idea for using these novel disorders was inspired by the developmental literature and the finding from the Zarpy study that language influences children's essentialist beliefs about novel social groups. So when we asked how participants would describe somebody with a mental illness, the majority responded that they preferred to use person-first language. And additionally, 70% of our participants reported having been diagnosed with a mental illness at some point in their life. So first, we asked if language impacted stigmatizing beliefs about characters with novel and real disorders to different degrees, because we thought participants they should be unlikely to have any preconceived beliefs about the 2 unfamiliar disorders. So here you can see the average stigma score for individuals in the vignettes, and it's collapsed across the 2 novel disorders on the left and then the 3 real disorders on the right. So you're seeing this for each language condition. The dotted line at 6 indicates the lowest possible stigma score. So that's equivalent to showing no stigma. And then error bars represent 95% confidence intervals. So when participants read about characters with real mental illnesses, those who read person-first language reported lower levels of stigmatizing beliefs than participants who read generic noun labels. And when they read about characters with novel illnesses, participants in the person-first condition also reported lower levels of stigmatizing beliefs than participants in the generic noun language and participants who were in the identity-first condition. So we also asked if language might impact individual disorders to different degrees. And in fact, this was the case, but only for career dysphoria, which is one of our novel disorders based on imposter syndrome and depression. But there were no effects of language condition on the stigmatizing beliefs about any of the other 3 disorders. So for average social essentialist beliefs about the disorders, the patterns of findings were quite different and it's surprising. So here the dotted line at 14 indicates the lowest possible essentialism score. And again, error bars represent 95% confidence intervals. So when reading about characters with real mental illnesses, participants who read person first or identity first language actually reported higher levels of social essentialism than participants who read the generic noun labels. But I want to note that this effect is very small. So I think it's totally possible that participants who were just assigned to the generic noun language condition had fewer essentialist beliefs about mental illness, because also participants who reported a preference for using person first language did report lower levels of essentialist beliefs than participants who said they preferred to use identity first or generic noun language. And then finally, when participants read about characters with novel, these made up disorders, language type didn't impact their essentialist beliefs. We did the same follow-up language comparisons for each disorder, but we didn't find any differences in the levels of essentialist beliefs between participants exposed to each language type. So finally, we did run correlations just to assess the relationships between measures of stigma and essentialism that were taken before and after our language manipulation. All of the correlations I'm going to show you are relatively small, but baseline levels of stigma were weakly but positively correlated with reported stigma against individuals, and moderately correlated with the reported essentialist beliefs about the disorder in our study. And they were weakly, but they were weakly but negative correlated with our baseline measure of essentialism. Our measure of stigma against individuals, which was reported after the language manipulation, was correlated with essentialist beliefs about the individual disorders, but baseline levels of essentialist beliefs were not correlated with reported stigma against the individuals in the vignettes, and most surprisingly, they were actually negatively correlated with essentialist beliefs about disorders. So what does all this mean? I think that given that most of these correlations, right, are really low, I think these measures just might be picking up on different aspects of stigma and essentialism. But perhaps most importantly, I think these analyses suggest that general essentialist beliefs, at least as they're measured by the fixed mindset scale, are just not predictive of similar attitudes and beliefs about mental illness. Okay. So just to conclude, we find a small but significant effective language for stigma and essentialist beliefs, but that effect depended on the type of mental illness that was described, right? And we found really different patterns for stigma and for essentialist beliefs. And I think these results cast doubt on the idea that using person-first language is actively reducing stigma and social essentialism for existing disorders. One possibility could be that language only impacts stigma for mental illnesses that are novel or relatively low stigma. And this could explain why we didn't find an effect for schizophrenia or for catarrhation, which is a novel disorder that's based on a real delusion that people with schizophrenia sometimes experience, because schizophrenia is particularly stigmatized, at least compared to other mental illnesses like depression. Some conclusions we can draw from this work, though, are that having pre-existing stigmatizing beliefs about mental illness predicts essentialist beliefs about specific mental illnesses, but greater social essentialism in general, right, this tendency to think that people can't change who they really are deep down inside, does not predict essentialist or stigmatizing beliefs specifically about mental illness. And in fact, people who reported higher general essentialism also reported lower stigma and essentialism about mental illness in our study. Another possibility, of course, is that there are more valid measures of general essentialist thinking. And if you have any ideas about this, I would love to hear them. So lastly, I do just want to mention one future direction that we would like to explore, which is, does language impact stigmatizing and essentialist beliefs about mental illness as they are developing in childhood? So this is a question that we are currently exploring. So if you're interested, I would love to talk more about it after the symposium or in the Q&A. And then just to end, I want to thank my collaborators, my advisor, Dr. Katherine Tillman, and Dr. Albin Folsler, and thank you all for your attention. And I believe we have some time for questions.